The early United States faced many difficulties. Navigating these issues required debate and compromise. A compromise is an agreement that requires everyone in negotiations to give up something they want. Later, we'll discuss two of the most profound compromises written into the Constitution. But first, let's take a closer look at the divisions and debates at the Constitutional Convention as we answer the lesson question: how did compromise play a role in the drafting of the Constitution?
In the 1780s, the United States was split into three regions: New England, the Mid-Atlantic, and the South. However, New England and the Mid-Atlantic shared many characteristics and were often considered the northern states. Culture and government in the North was often dominated by the large cities that had developed there. New York, Philadelphia, and Boston had grown into important trading centers with bustling harbors and shipyards. In the South, Charleston was the biggest port, but was much smaller than northern cities. The U.S. economy relied almost entirely on farming. In the North, farms were smaller. They were owned by families and mostly produced food staples such as meat, dairy products, fruits, and vegetables. In the South, food staples were raised, but agriculture was dominated by large plantations in the production of cash crops, such as tobacco. What became the defining feature separating the two regions, however, was the institution of slavery. Both the northern states and southern states had benefited economically from the enslavement of Black people. In 1619, the first ship brought enslaved people from Africa and landed on the shores of Virginia. But by the mid-1700s, slavery was practiced in all 13 colonies. After the American Revolution, Pennsylvania was the first state to partially abolish slavery, and Massachusetts was the first to outlaw it entirely. By 1787, the rest of New England had ended slavery, while steps were being taken in other northern states to reduce and eventually eliminate it. However, the enslavement of people to work on plantations and elsewhere in the South had grown into an institution used by wealthy landowners, but it also had broader impacts on the economy and colonial society. The differences between the North and South, both cultural and economic, would need to be addressed at the Constitutional Convention. But when the debate started, no one knew how a solution would be reached. It was clear only that each state was intent on protecting its own interests. These interests also included the distribution of power in the federal government.
Power is the ability to control people or events. The largest states, as you can see on this map, were Virginia and Pennsylvania. Notice their population ranges in the darker colors of the key. The delegates and residents felt that because of the state's size, they were entitled to have more power in the government. Why? Remember, the United States was established in part on the idea of popular sovereignty, the government of the people, by the people. So, what better way to express popular sovereignty than to give the most power to the most people? The smaller states objected, of course. States like Delaware, Georgia, and New Jersey, with much lower populations, did not want to be pushed around by the larger states. They understood and supported the idea of popular sovereignty within their states, but they felt they deserved an equal amount of power in the federal government. How divisive was this issue? Edmund Randolph, a Virginia delegate to the convention, said, "If a fair representation of the people be not secured, the injustice of the government will shake it to its foundations." Randolph was a prominent lawyer and politician, and an enslaver from Virginia. This was not only one of the largest states, but also one that was deeply dependent on slavery. Randolph's statement underlined the idea that the Constitutional Convention delegates had to figure out these problems or injustices and get them right, or the new government will be shaken to its foundations. Let's check your understanding of the issues facing the delegates. In the first part of this lesson, you looked at the most prominent divisions and debates facing the Constitutional Convention. Next, we will look at how one of these important issues was resolved through what many people call the Great Compromise. This will help you better answer the lesson question. How did compromise play a role in the drafting of the Constitution? Central to the Constitutional Convention was the debate over how representation in the legislature would be determined. Would it be based on population? In that case, states with larger populations would have more representatives. Or would it be equally distributed? In that case, each state would have the same number of representatives. These questions were linked to larger debates over the power of the federal government versus states' rights, larger states versus smaller states, and agricultural southern states versus urban northern states. Two plans were presented to answer these questions: the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. Let's begin with the Virginia Plan. Remember earlier in the lesson, the image that included James Madison? Madison was another prominent leader during the American Revolution who had become a vocal critic of the Articles of Confederation. He supported a much stronger central government. Madison was also from Virginia and believed the federal government should be controlled by the most populous states. He proposed the Virginia Plan, which supported the interests of the states with the larger populations. The plan called for a bicameral legislature with representation based on states' populations. You might recall that bicameral means having two parts. This meant that the federal legislature, which makes the laws, would have two houses. Both houses would be filled with members elected in each state, and each state would have members determined by their population. This is called proportional representation. If state number one has twice the population of state number two, state number one would elect twice as many members as the less populated state. The Virginia Plan would have guaranteed that large states, such as Virginia and Pennsylvania, controlled the creation of federal laws. Try to imagine what that might look like now with the country's largest states, California, Texas, Florida, and New York, controlling Congress. As you can imagine, the small states opposed this plan and proposed one of their own. The New Jersey Plan was proposed by William Paterson, a lawyer and attorney general of New Jersey who would later become governor. The plan supported the interests of smaller states. It called for a unicameral legislature with each state having only one vote. The word unicameral describes something that has only one part. Under Paterson's proposal, the legislature would have only one house, which meant that each state had an equal amount of power in creating federal laws. Imagine again what such a plan might look like today, with a Congress that only had 50 members, one from each state. Let's take a moment to check your understanding of the Virginia and New Jersey plans.
establishing a new government, early U.S. lawmakers had to figure out some basic issues. One of them was how states should be represented within the federal government. This would determine how much voting and decision making power each state had. During the 1787 Constitutional Convention, the issue was resolved with something called the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise created the form of government used in the United States today. It divided the legislature into the House of Representatives and the Senate. The plan was written by Connecticut delegates Roger Sherman and Oliver Ellsworth, which is why it's also called the Connecticut Plan. It took ideas from the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan. The Great Compromise proposed a bicameral legislature. There would be two parts to Congress, and each part would use a different method to determine how states were represented. One part, the House of Representatives, would use proportional representation. This idea came from the Virginia Plan. States with larger populations would elect more members to the House, while smaller states would elect fewer representatives. The other part, the Senate, would use equal representation. This idea came from the New Jersey Plan. So each state, no matter how big or small it was, would have the same number of senators. Today, the Great Compromise is still in place. The United States uses data from the census to determine representation. The latest census took place in 2020. Based on that data, California, which is the state with the largest population, has 52 members in the House of Representatives. There are 7 states with only 1 member: Alaska, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Vermont, and Delaware. And every state still has 2 senators. So the states were able to come to an agreement about how they should be represented. What do you think about this compromise?
You learned about the divisions between the different states, and you also learned about how one of these divisions was settled with the Great Compromise. Next, you will learn about what was called the Three-Fifths Compromise, which involved slavery in the United States and whether enslaved people would be counted in a state's population. Understanding this will help you answer the lesson question: how did compromise play a role in the drafting of the Constitution? Governor Morris of New York was a Pennsylvania delegate to the Constitutional Convention who vehemently opposed the institution of slavery. During an impassioned speech, Morris said this: "Upon what principle is it that the slaves shall be counted in the representation? Are they men? Then make them citizens and let them vote. Are they property? Why then is no other property included? And what is the proposed compensation to the northern states for a sacrifice of every principle of right, every impulse of humanity? They are to bind themselves to march their militia for the defense of the southern states, for the defense against those very slaves of whom they complain." What is Morris saying here? He's asking the other delegates to think about enslaved people who had no representation at the meeting and how they should be treated. If they are people, then treat them as citizens. Morris tries to flip the logic of considering people as property by asking why no other type of property is included. Also, Morris asks what the North gains from allowing slavery to continue. In sacrificing the right thing to do for representation, the North will be required to defend slavery. Morris's plea made little difference. Out of the 55 delegates, 17 owned around 1,400 enslaved people, which was essential to their wealth. The convention moved from how states should be represented in government to whether enslaved people should be counted as part of a state's population. This would be an important factor for the power that states had in government.
Following the Great Compromise, the House of Representatives would include proportional representation. That meant states with larger populations would have more representatives and more power. This brought into question how to count enslaved persons. As Governor Morris had noted, enslaved people couldn't vote and didn't have representation in government or at the convention. Nonetheless, they became part of the debate. The northern states argued that enslaved people should not be counted when figuring proportional representation. Why? Their state populations would not increase much, and they would not gain representation in Congress. The southern states, of course, wanted all enslaved people counted as part of the population, as part of the total population, because this would increase the state's representation and power in the House.
Southern states would see dramatic increases in their population figures and increased power in Congress if enslaved people were counted. Northern states didn't want to give more power to slaveholding states, so they opposed the measure.
In 1790, nearly 700,000 enslaved people were counted in the U.S. Census. Although they were counted in all 13 states, the vast majority of them were in the South. Counting them all for proportional representation would greatly increase the number of members that Southern states would get to elect. Counting none of them would greatly decrease the number of representatives. The delegates found a way to bridge this divide.
James Wilson, a delegate from Pennsylvania and one of the 4 men pictured earlier in the lesson, proposed what became known as the 3/5 Compromise. Under this constitutional provision, states were allowed to include some of their enslaved population in their total population. For every 5 enslaved people in the state, 3 of them would be counted toward representation. This gave more power to Southern states, but limited their impact on representation in Congress. This compromise had enormous consequences. The 3/5 Compromise shaped the politics and decisions of the United States for more than 70 years and continues to affect the country. States with slavery gained power while not having to advocate for the enslaved people in their states. Historians agree that under this compromise, Southern states had more votes in Congress than they would have if enslaved people had not been counted. And because the Electoral College is based on congressional representation, Southern states had more power when choosing a president. Historians look at the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800 and question whether John Adams would have lost had the South not been given so much power. They also question whether some laws, such as the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which passed by only 4 votes, would have been the same. The 3/5 Clause was never removed from the Constitution. However, the ratification of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments after the Civil War ended slavery and granted citizenship and voting rights, making the clause no longer applicable. Now take a moment to check your understanding of the 3/5 Compromise.